Great writing is all about choosing words that matter, words that can move, inspire, words that change your reader, words that jump off the page and smack your reader in the face. But how do you find those words? How do you write words that make people laugh, cry, can transform them, can change people? How do you write words that matter? It's actually easier than you think. We're going to spend this level looking at how to write those kinds of words, how to find words that are more than just letters on a page. So we'll start by looking at a few basic techniques you can use to create meaning in your writing. These techniques we're going to look at today are simile, metaphor, hyperbole, and personification. 4 techniques, let's go. A simile is when a writer compares one thing to another. So, for example, if a writer wanted to say that a character is very tall, they might say, he was like a skyscraper towering over the others. There's a comparison between the man and the skyscraper to show how tall he is. Or if a writer wanted to say it was really hot, they might say it was as hot as the inside of a pizza oven. So they're comparing the heat of the day to being inside a pizza oven. They're comparing these two things to create a more strong image, strengthen the idea of the heat. If a writer wanted to say there was a really bright camera flash, you could say the flash was brighter than the sun. What you're looking for is words that are like, as, than, any kind of word that is comparing one thing to another. If these words are in the sentence, if these words are used, it's going to be a simile because you're comparing these things like, as, than. Look for those words. Similes are especially good for exaggeration and humor because you can make unexpected and funny comparisons between objects and ideas. So he was like a walrus emerging from the ocean puts a pretty funny image of this man in the reader's mind. Try not to have overly complicated similes though. For example, she was sadder than a woman whose husband had just been eaten by a rabid and overly aggressive hamster. Probably not the right way to go. It's a bit too complicated. Unless you're going for a funny effect, try to keep your similes roughly, fairly simple. Or, this guy's going to get you. Let's look at metaphors now. A metaphor is when a writer says that one thing is another. This is more direct than a simile because it leaves out the words like, as, than, so on. They're not included in the metaphor. So using our example before, instead of saying, he was like a skyscraper towering over the others, we delete the word like, and we simply say, he was a skyscraper towering over the others. It takes out the comparison and it makes it a more direct and more powerful image. Similes are generally not as strong as metaphors because metaphors are a far more direct way of comparing and creating that image in our mind. What about the wind was ice is another example of a metaphor. Wind isn't actually ice, that would really hurt, but we're saying it was ice to show how cold the wind is. Or his heart exploded when he saw her. Well, hopefully, unless it's a very violent story, his heart didn't actually explode when he saw her. So this is another example of a metaphor. It's telling us something about his reaction to her by using the metaphor of an explosion. Another metaphor could be the ducklings were bowled over by the wind. Kind of like this. The example the ducklings were bowled over is saying that the ducklings are like bowling pins, which they're not unless you're the worst person ever in the worst bowling game of all time. If you're trying to remember the difference between a simile and a metaphor, think of the word similar. So a simile is saying that something is similar to something else. So the words are very connected there. So if it's saying like or as or then, it's similar to something else. A metaphor is saying that it actually is something else. So that's the best way to remember those two things. Simile equals similar, metaphor is not that. Moving on to hyperbole. Hyperbole is the use of exaggeration to create meaning. It's not hyperbole, okay? It's hyperbole, using exaggeration to create meaning. As an example, when they broke up, his whole world collapsed. This shows you just how much the breakup has affected this guy. His whole world didn't actually collapse unless you're writing some sort of apocalyptic story. We're exaggerating, we're using hyperbole to show how bad things are. You could say also, his school bag weighed a ton. Well, his bag doesn't really weigh a ton, that would be crazy, but it's showing you how heavy it is by exaggerating the weight. That's hyperbole. Sometimes you see hyperboles inside a metaphor or a simile. For example, he was as thin as a twig. Well, this is hyperbole because it's saying he's as thin as a stick, which he couldn't possibly be. But it's also using the word as, so we're comparing. This is what we could call hyperbolic simile. There's actually two things happening at once in the same sentence. If you're trying to remember hyperbole, think of someone who's hyper, like this kid here.
How much sugar have you had this morning?
So when someone's hyper, everything they do is faster, bigger, more dramatic than normal. So think of it, it's exaggerated. Hyper equals hyperbole. Think about that exaggeration idea. Finally, personification. Personification is giving non-human things human attributes. It's giving non-human things human attributes. As an example, the sun smiled at us. Creates this image of a bright, sunny day. The sun isn't really smiling though, that's a human characteristic, unless you watch the Teletubbies, and quite frankly this sun is just disturbing. So, another example, the chair howled in protest as she sat down. Well, a chair's not actually howling or protesting. It's not doing those things. Chairs can't protest, but it's giving the image of maybe a fairly large woman and the chair is having a whinge as she sits down. So it's creating this really strong image of the chair maybe creaking and cracking and groaning as she sits down on it. That's personification. An easy word to remember personification is the word that's right in there in the word, person. Personification, turning something into a person. So if you're not sure what it is, think of personification. So to sum up, here's a slide that gives you an overall view. Simile, when a writer compares one thing to another. Metaphor, when a writer says that one thing is another. Hyperbole is the use of exaggeration to create meaning. And personification, giving non-human things human attributes.